Now Lewis considers how the naturalist might answer this argument. In other words, Lewis is a good philosopher. He realizes that just because he's given what looks like a proof against naturalism doesn't mean his proof holds up. How might the smart naturalist object to his position? And the objections he brings up can be grouped into two categories, and I'll consider them each in turn. The key here, though, is to understand that even though Lewis writes this in the early 1940s or so, these objections are still ones that are being raised by modern philosophers who are naturalists. So he really does a good job in anticipating his enemy or his opponent's response. Now, the first response is the most popular, and that is what we might call the natural selection response. Think of it like this. Let's say you have two cavemen, they're in the jungle, they're walking in the jungle, and then all of a sudden a tiger jumps out in front of them, ready to pounce. Let's say the one caveman, let's call him Bob, looks at the tiger and says, "Oh, the tiger loves me. He's a big, fluffy friend." The other caveman, let's call him Joe, says, "Ooh, the tiger wants to eat me, and it desires my death so that I could be its food." Now, they hold different beliefs, don't they? Bob holds a very false belief, and Joe holds a true belief. Which belief is more useful? Which one will contribute to their survival? Well, obviously, Bob's belief seems to lead to Bob's death because Bob might just stand there, wait for the tiger to come hug him, or might run to the tiger to pet him and hug him, and that belief is not useful. It won't be selected for. Joe will either try to fight or flee, and therefore his true belief is more useful than Bob's false belief. You might say, therefore, that true beliefs contribute to survival. Natural selection selects for beliefs that will lead to survival, and so therefore we can see why there would be a correlation between the thought processes that are rational and lead to truth versus and survival, and that there wouldn't be a correlation between false beliefs and survival. And so the natural selection response says, now we can see why that even though there's no necessary correlation between the physical causes of our beliefs and the fact that they're rational, there still would be this actual correlation because natural selection selects for true beliefs. If you didn't have mostly true beliefs, you wouldn't survive to reproduce, and therefore the natural selection favors those whose thought processes are more in line with reason, even though they aren't produced because of reason. Now, how might Lewis respond to this? Well, first of all, it makes this big assumption, doesn't it? In order for the argument to work, it must assume that useful implies true. That because natural selection, the evolutionist must admit, doesn't, strictly speaking, select these beliefs because they're true. It selects them because they're useful. In other words, any belief that leads to survival, natural selection will select for. The claim, therefore, is that the more useful a belief is, the more likely it is to be true. That useful somehow implies or makes it more probable that it's true. But you notice, that itself is an assumption of the argument. It doesn't argue for it. And so therefore, what does it assume in the argument? It assumes that we are able, through our reason, to grasp that useful implies true. But it's inference and reason itself that is on trial here. That's what Lewis is claiming. So you're trying to give a proof for proofs, for the validity of proofs. But then you're assuming the validity of the very thing you were trying to prove. You are arguing in a circle. Circular reason can never prove its point because proof depends on having independent reasons for believing that something is true. Let me give you a really easy example to grasp why circular reasoning never works. Let's say I want to argue and prove to you that God exists. And here's my proof. The Bible tells me that God is real. You would naturally ask me, why should I believe the Bible? And then I tell you, well, because God inspired it and God is infallible. You should rightly laugh at that proof. It doesn't work. Why? Because what it's saying is God exists because the Bible is true. And the Bible is true because God exists. So therefore, why does God exist? Because God exists. You see the circle there? You see how totally ineffective it is in proving that God exists because it already assumes that it exists. And that's the very thing you deny. Here we're doing the same thing. We're saying our beliefs are rational because reason proves it. But the problem is we don't know whether the rational process that you just used is valid. And now you want to use that rational process to prove itself. That, my friend, is circular. Doesn't work. But let's assume it even did. Let's assume that we somehow can grasp this statement, useful implies true. It's not. It doesn't follow. Actually, useful doesn't imply true, neither probabilistically nor deductively. The assumption is provably false. To show this to you, let us go back to our tiger example, Bob and Joe. Bob believes the tiger loves him. Joe believes the tiger wants to eat him. Both have beliefs. Which one leads to survival? You might say, well, depending on what Bob believes about the tiger, his false belief might lead to survival also. How might that be the case? Well, think, let's say Bob believes the tiger loves him, but that the tiger wants Bob to play hard to get. And wants Bob to be afraid and to poke him with spears. That's the only way the tiger will accept Bob's love, so that if Bob runs up to him, the tiger will eat him because he grows angry at him. So Bob, therefore, believing that the tiger wants him to play hard to get, runs away or pokes him with pointy sticks. He does the exact same behavior as Joe would, doesn't he? And so therefore, since natural selection selects for survival behavior, as long as that false belief leads to survival behavior, then it will be selected for too, won't it? In other words, just because a belief is useful doesn't mean it's true. In fact, we know just the opposite many times. Viktor Frankl, a very famous Holocaust survivor who is also a psychologist, did a study while he was in the concentration camps, in the death camp of Auschwitz. And what he discovered is that there was a correlation between those who survived Auschwitz and those who had strong religious beliefs about the meaning of life. In other words, he said, he asked the question, what was it that caused people to be able to survive? What distinguished the person who survived versus the person who didn't survive? His answer? Believing that there was transcendent meaning in life. Now let's say that's not true. It wouldn't make a difference, would it? If you believed, if that belief that life is meaningful and therefore you should preserve your life at all costs is what you really believe, it will motivate you to be determined to resist and to go through suffering. Where the person who believes that life is meaningless and that it's hopeless to live and it's a big waste of time would be less likely to try to survive a tiger attack or the depredations of the cruelty of Nazism and anti-Semitism. And so we see that a lot of times false beliefs contribute to our survival better than true beliefs. When a person who has cancer believes against all odds that they can survive this and win, it is medically proven that they're more likely through this placebo effect to survive the cancer than the person who gives up mentally and thinks it's impossible, even though the person who gives up might have better rational reasons than the person who believes against all rationality that they can survive. And so useful doesn't imply true, and true doesn't imply useful. Sometimes the most useful beliefs are the ones that are totally irrational. So natural selection doesn't necessarily select for true beliefs, and so therefore we can say the whole argument is either circular or false. Now, what about the fact, though, that it seems to work, that our reasoning does seem to lead to truth? In the past, for example, every time I saw smoke, most of the time it was accompanied by fire. And then I reasoned thus, oh, there's smoke in the distance. Whenever there's smoke, there is fire. Therefore, there's smoke, there must be fire. And whenever, therefore, I use this principle of reasoning, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q, it led to successful reasoning. And this is what you might call the argument from experience. You might say, look, whenever I believed that a triangle had interior angles of 180 degrees or two right angles, that therefore the triangle, when I actually measured it, did have that. Or whenever I believed that two equal things added together, that equals added to equals turn out equals, then that's what actually happened when I measured it. This argument, though, is silly, because what you're trying to do is give a probabilistic argument for what, if you believe it at all, you must believe as a necessary truth, as what must be the case. And just because it's probably true doesn't mean it must be true. And so if that's your argument, you're trying to ground 2 plus 2 equals 4 by every time we added 2 plus 2, it equals 4. But that's not a good enough reason to believe it, because if you did believe it, you have to believe it because it must be true. But moreover, it suffers from the same malady as the original argument. It's circular, because it's assuming that our process of reasoning, called inductive reasoning, is a reliable process. But that process itself is called into question by this idea that all of those beliefs are arising from non-rational and therefore not even inductive processes of reasoning. So either what Lewis is then claiming is this: look, any attempt, once naturalism is called into question the cause of our beliefs, and therefore called into question our reasoning itself, therefore any attempt to reason our way to a proof that cause and effect will somehow lead to logical truth will itself suffer from the fact that it's trying to prove something by relying on the thing itself that it's trying to prove, and therefore will always argue in a big circle. Therefore, what's the only conclusion we can draw? That if naturalism is true, then now none of our beliefs come out of rationality. They come out of non-rational and therefore doubtful processes. But then the answer to why I believe something can never be given a good answer, can it? It will always be doubtful that what I believe grounds it really does. And therefore, once we believe naturalism, we call into doubt all knowledge, including our knowledge of rationalism.